Hello, and welcome to another edition of Mjolnir at the Movies Intermission. And I wanted to continue with a little discussion on John Boorman's Excalibur, really because I just love talking about this film, but I wanted to, in particular, look more on the Merlin theme, particularly the relationship between Merlin and Morgana. Morgana is interesting because she's sort of a mixture of three different characters, because you have a condensation of characters in Excalibur, because of course you can't have all the characters that are in Arthurian legend in the film, because it would get terribly confusing. So what they've done is, we talked a little about it in the previous show, Boorman has condensed several characters into one. The example I think we gave, if I remember rightly, was the one of Percival, who is both Percival and Sir Bedivere. Now, Morgana is basically Morgan Le Fay, Morgause, and Vivienne. And Vivienne is sort of, again, very odd in very different, she's very different things in different interpretations of the legend, because she can sometimes be the Lady of the Lake as well. But in Tennyson's Vivienne, in Idylls of the King, for example, and we're going to sort of look at different aspects of the Arthurian legend in different traditions and different authors. In Tennyson's version, Vivienne very much is like, personality-wise, the Morgana that you have in Excalibur. Now, there is this odd relationship between Merlin and Morgana, in that, to begin with, Merlin, of course, is immortal. He's pretty much tied to nature, and is almost part of the dragon. He sometimes fuses with the dragon of nature, particularly when he's using his magical powers. And this is, of course, why when Arthur goes and finds Lancelot and Guinevere in the forest, and he strikes the sword into the ground, why it strikes Merlin through the heart. And I don't think that a lot of the critics got that, particularly Roger Ebert, who does not understand this film at all, or the ideas of myth and symbolism and so on. But Merlin is immortal, as opposed to Morgana, Merlin is immortal as opposed to Morgana, who is mortal. Of course, we see her when she's a child, when Merlin gives Uther the power to disguise himself as Gaulois, the Duke of Cornwall, so that he can go and impregnate, to have sex basically. He doesn't really mean to impregnate her, he just wants to have sex with Igraine, although Merlin makes sure that the pregnancy takes hold, and that Igraine gives birth to Arthur. And basically, Merlin's immortality and Morgana's mortality contrast with each other, because Morgana seeks for power to become immortal herself. And this we see, of course, later on, when she has spent all her power on retaining her youth. And so Merlin, equally, he has a flaw, because he's immortal, in that he cannot really relate to humans that well. Now, in the traditions that give a backstory to Merlin, namely really the poetic Merlin and the prose Merlin, Interestingly, Merlin is the son of either the devil or a demon working for the devil, who impregnates a virgin. And he is designed to be the Antichrist. And but he's baptized when he's born, and so this breaks his predestination and gives him free will. But he still obviously has the sort of powers and magical powers of some kind of demon or whatever. Now, in Boorman's film, of course, he's tied and bound up with nature, because of course the dragon is not Christian in Boorman's film. The dragon is nature, and when Arthur goes against nature, this is when the problems start. Ultimately, of course, he goes against Merlin. He goes against Merlin's advice, and therefore he's going against nature. And equally, Morgana goes against nature, in that she attempts to defy natural law, in that she, for a start, she spends all her power on looking youthful, and so denying the aging process. But equally, she has this incestuous child, of course, Mordred. Mordred is interesting in that in traditions, the original traditions, Mordred is actually the son of Morgause, who is Morgan Le Fay's sister. These are two daughters of Igraine, and so therefore both Morgause and Morgana, Morgan Le Fay, are Arthur's half sisters. I know this is getting confusing here, and I've got to kind of work it out in my head. But Mordred turns against Arthur and tries to usurp the kingdom and take it for himself in the traditions. Now, later on, of course, he becomes Arthur's illegitimate child or whatever, and turns against the father. And this is the case with Excalibur, although the incestuous nature is, I think that really comes from Volsunga Saga, and from Wagner's Ring, and this is highlighted, of course, with the music that is chosen, which is from Wagner's Ring. But in any case, this is seen to be unnatural, the unnatural birth, and this is why the land turns putrid and rotten, and why there is widespread misery and so on, because of this unnatural birth to the king. And of course the king and the land are one, which is what Arthur forgets. So in the end, well, not in the end, but sort of about 2/3 of the way through the film, there is this imprisoning scene, and this comes from Merlin's relationship with Morgana. Now, Merlin, of course, he's fascinated by love and by the beauty of women, because he cannot have these things as he's immortal. And yet he covets them and he wants them. And equally, on the other hand, Morgana, she covets power and sees Merlin as a means towards that power. And so the two of them, they're both attracted and repelled to each other at the same time. And this is something that Tennyson very much looks at in Idylls of the King. Although interestingly, in Idylls of the King, in the part, there are 12 parts to Idylls of the King, each with a separate story, and this is Merlin and Vivienne. And Vivienne is actually more attracted to Merlin than Merlin is towards Vivienne. Although, again, it's very complex. And in this tradition, in this poem, Merlin is actually imprisoned in a tree. He's tricked during a thunderstorm into giving Morgana the spells and so on that she learns and uses to imprison him. In this case, it's in an oak tree, but equally in other traditions, and I think in the prose Merlin, he's actually imprisoned in a cave, which is the case, of course, in Excalibur. In this case, the rumbling is not of thunder, of course, but a sort of a mini earthquake, which is caused by Lancelot and Guinevere's being found in the forest by Arthur and him stabbing the sword into the spine of the dragon, as Merlin states. And in his confusion, he gives the charm of making to Morgana. I'm going to give a little poetry reading here, which is Tennyson's version of this. So from Merlin and Vivienne, and this is the end where Merlin is imprisoned. The pale blood of the wizard at her touch took gayer colours, like an opal warmed. She blamed herself for telling hearsay tales. She shook from fear, and for her fault she wept of petulancy. She called him lord and liege, her seer, her bard, her silver star of eve, her god, her Merlin, the one passionate love of her whole life, and ever overheard below the tempest. And then the rotten branch snapped at the rushing of the river rain above them, and in change of glare and gloom her eyes and neck glittering went and came, till now the storm, its burst of passion spent, moaning and calling out of other lands, had left the ravaged woodland yet once more to peace, and what should not have been had been, for Merlin, overtalked and overworn, had yielded, told her all the charm, and slept. Then in one moment she put forth the charm of woven paces and of waving hands, and in the hollow oak he lay as dead, and lost to life and use of name and fame. Then crying, I have made of this his glory mine, and shrieking out, O fool, the harlot leapt adown the forest, and the thicket closed behind her, and the forest echoed fool. And that is very interesting, actually, because it shows Merlin is extremely wise, and yet he has some foolishness to him, as is seen, of course, when he tries to outsmart the fish. When Arthur is fighting Lancelot, he's busy preoccupied with trying to catch the fish, and ends up falling into the water. He has this sort of duality to him in that he's infinitely wise, and yet at the same time can be absolutely outsmarted by the simplest of things. And particularly Morgana, of course, she uses her wiles and her charms to outsmart him. But of course he gets his revenge at the end, in that this is quite interesting, in that Arthur brings him back, and Merlin says that your love brought me back, and that is very interesting. That's because Arthur and Merlin are connected, and Arthur, of course, he's standing in the stone ring, this magic stone ring at the time, that is connected to the place where Merlin is imprisoned, and he cannot physically leave. But because Arthur brings him back in his thoughts, he sort of brings back the ghost of Merlin. He brings back the spirit of Merlin, because he brings back the spirit of Merlin in him. And the Merlin says that he's part of dreams, a dream to some, a nightmare to others, of course, as he says. After Arthur asks him if he lives in our dreams now, and Merlin of course cannot physically come back, but he does come back enough to, of course, to visit Morgana while she's asleep, and he visits her in her dreams and gets her to chant the charm of making while she's asleep, and of course this is what gives Arthur his advantage in the battle, as a fog comes from her mouth, both undoing the spell that she has woven about herself to keep her eternally young, and also, as I say, it gives out the fog that gives Arthur his cover, so that it belies his numbers in battle with Mordred. Now, to come on to Mordred, which is the last thing I'm going to look at, Mordred is interesting in that he wears gold armor, and I think there's a certain political symbolism with this, because Boorman is a leftist, but he's one of those sort of old-fashioned leftists of the anti-capitalist sort. This is very interesting because the left often, or the old left often, approach the territory of the old right, especially if they're going to make a film that is based on aristocratic ideals. And this is the thing. This is why Excalibur is such a rightist film, in that Boorman wants to critique liberalism, essentially, and in making a film about kings and aristocracy and so on, he can only make it from the right, and because that is the true criticism of liberalism. And Mordred, of course, he dresses in gold. If you look at Morgana's little palace that she has, it's of luxury and ease and wealth and so on. And and this is how she tempts some of the knights and brings them over to her, of course. And they're tempted by luxury and by the pleasures of the body, which of course Percival as the chaste knight. Traditionally in Arthurian legend, he's a chaste knight, and he passes the test of this attempt to corrupt him through the body. Now, of course, these things are associated with liberalism, luxury and pleasure and so on. If one reads such philosophers as Jeremy Bentham, for example, his philosophy is very much predicated on the pleasure principle. So, in his gold armor, you've got Mordred, who is very much the personification of that. And we could perhaps almost see Morgana as Thatcher. It wouldn't be such a far-fetched interpretation, because there is very much this idea that these are symbolic of the new right, as it was called, although not the right in any sense at all, because the new right that sprung up in the 1970s, particularly under the end of the 70s, really, particularly under Reagan and Thatcher, this was actually old liberalism in any case, really Austrian school economics or Manchester school economics, which comes from classical liberalism, in other words, from the old Whig Party. And the economic philosopher Friedrich Hayek brought this back, this high capitalist ethic, and in fact Margaret Thatcher used to carry this book by Hayek around with her in her handbag that she called her Bible. Believe it or not, but absolutely true. And so this is sort of a critique, but in a film like this, it has to be a critique from further right, and this is the true critique of liberalism, the critique from aristocratic ideas, and these are what are important. And if one has to critique capitalism, and one does have to critique capitalism because it is destroying the world, then it really has to be from the right. So, I'm David Yorkshire, editor of Mjolnir magazine, and bye for now. We'll get back soon with another full episode. Thanks for listening. Bye.